I recognize the member for Toronto-Danforth.
Thank you very much, Speaker. I have to say I'm surprised the government isn't standing up defending this substantial bill before us, but they aren't, so here I am. There are a few things I wanted to say about the bill before I went into detail. One is that environmental assessments are one of the few tools that people have to protect their interests, to protect the larger interests of Ontarians around environmental issues. And when you propose changes that don't, in fact, enhance protection of the environment or the population, one has to be very suspicious about what those changes really will deliver on. So we believe that the environment, those of us who depend on the environment, so all living humans, should be protected. And we have grave concern about this proposal to reduce the period for consideration of commentary by people on environmental initiatives. I have to say, Speaker, and you've sat through question period on a regular basis. You, for your sins, have sat in that chair when we've debated bills. You have heard what goes on or does not go on in committees. And as you're well aware, interest in commentary or public input is extraordinarily low. Extraordinarily low. And this government, in its behaviour towards environmental matters, has a very consistent record, and that is one of ignoring environmental concerns. This is a government that's involved right now in carving up the Greenbelt, involved in deals that are generally seen as shady, smelly, smoky, take your pick. When you have a government that is undermining its own credibility by not trying to appear above reproach, you have to ask substantial questions about what actually is going to happen when even the smaller changes to environmental protection are undermined. We've seen in the past the abuse of ministerial zoning orders to ram through developer deals despite the opposition of local communities, except, of course, when a minister's interests are involved. As a minister in Northern Toronto was upset about some low-income housing, that being put on the back burner. And as my colleague from Spadina-Fort York can attest in great detail, this is a government spending about $650 million of public money, which is going to enable the giveaway of a massive chunk of Ontario Place to the for-profit company based out of Austria. Ontario Place, that is a lakefront park meant for all Ontarians, not to be sold off. Any other park that you start selling off chunks in this city or anywhere else in the province raises substantial questions. This government is just acting as if this is normal, and to be fair, for them, it is normal. So let's look at what's in the bill. Schedule 1, the Environmental Assessment Act, it's an amazingly small bill, so I'll just give it the quick treatment. The changes to the Environmental Assessment Act allows the Environment Minister to waive the 30-day waiting period currently required following the end of a Class EA comment before granting an approval to proceed with an undertaking. Speaker, the reason you have a waiting period is the assumption that the minister will actually think about what came in. It will provide a period when those who have participated in any consultation process will have an opportunity informally to go to the minister and say, an awful lot of people had concerns here. You have the power to address those concerns. We ask you, Minister, to address them. The other part of this bill, the Ministry of Infrastructure Act, allows the ministry to assume control of real estate interests of prescribed entities that currently manage their own real estate interests. Now, this is fascinating. The real estate services for these entities will presumably move to Infrastructure Ontario, which oversees real estate services for most government properties. What's interesting here is that apparently the government claims that This change, giving more power to Infrastructure Ontario, is a response to the Auditor General's 2017 report on real estate. And I went and looked at the Auditor General's report, and she was pretty tough on what was going on what was being done by Infrastructure Ontario. And I don't see anything in this bill, nor have I heard any public statement from the government, that they're actually going to deal with the problems that Infrastructure Ontario manifests, that were pointed out in 2017. I'll just note a few. 2017, the Auditor General found that almost $19 million was spent in 1 year on operating and maintaining 812 vacant buildings. Wow. That's a lot of buildings. You know, if you're just pouring money out and you're not using places, money that could be used for housing, could be used for upgrading other buildings, possibly the vacant buildings could be used to relocate government services so that we aren't paying rent to someone else. That doesn't strike me as a very well-managed portfolio. She noted that capital repair funds used to fund operating costs, capital repair funds were being used to fund operating costs for managing government properties. I used to be a property manager in the co-op housing sector. I didn't use capital funds for operating. And I'll be honest, I mean, I picked it up as I went along. I went to a few workshops, I talked to others, talked to property managers, and they were all pretty clear. You don't mix the two streams, not if you're running an above-board shop. So that is a real concern. And the Auditor General also noted the office space per person exceeds the ministry standards. So we are spending more overall on real estate than we needed to. That's the agency that the government wants to move more real estate control into. So I haven't heard, and maybe I will be surprised, maybe I will be shock speaker and go home tonight and say, I had no idea. But maybe the government has dramatically reformed Infrastructure Ontario so that none of these things would be repeated. However, I have my doubts. I also want to say a bit more about the environmental assessment end. As I had said before, the reason for the 30 days is to give people an opportunity, the bureaucracy and the political decision makers, some time to think about what's at hand. And one would hope that having explored, having investigated, having listened to the people, that a thoughtful bureaucrat, a thoughtful minister, would take corrective action where necessary or conclude that the information given has validated the initial assumptions. One of the questions that came up earlier to one of my colleagues was about the need for efficiency and deregulation. And I don't know about you, but I was around when the Walkerton water crisis happened. Right. And deregulation, voluntary rules instead of actual regulation, were central to that crisis, that catastrophe, that loss of life. And an initiative to peel away regulations that protect life and health make no sense to me. That is not efficiency. That is irresponsibility. And I'll give you another example of deregulation on a larger scale that didn't involve tainted water, but did involve tainted finances. You were here, I think, Speaker, in 2008 during the international financial crisis. We grilled the government of the day about their behaviour. They actually bought into it. They had hundreds of millions of dollars of, what can I say, paper assets that were of no consequence anymore. And we went after them on that. People should understand that that crisis, at heart, was a failure of the regulatory system. That the companies that packaged and sold those junk financial products were unregulated. And so when a government pursues a deregulation strategy, I see both tainted water and financial chaos. And in both cases, in the aftermath, at least with the water, some steps were taken substantially to protect people's health. I think with regard to the financial crisis, not as many steps were taken. that remains a work in progress. Well, a work unfinished and untouched. Speaker, I don't support this bill, and I don't have confidence that the government will actually protect either our real estate holdings or the environment.
Thank you. Questions to the member for Toronto-Danforth? The member for Essex.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I had the opportunity to address this bill on an impromptu basis yesterday, and I was really struck by the long list of different government agencies that had real estate making authority. In fact, the list was so long that somebody had to actually write it down for me and pass it to me so that I could read the list. It was that long. I couldn't remember it. It was so long I couldn't remember it. There was like 14 agencies on it. And it really struck me that gosh, that's a lot of organizations, all that have real estate making authority for the government of the province of Ontario. And so my question to the member from Toronto-Danforth, thank you, is the following. Is 14 different government agencies making real estate decisions too many? Is it too few? Or is it just the right amount?
Member for Toronto-Danforth.
Well, I thank the member for Essex for the question. It's a good one. I don't know what the optimum number is. I do know that the agencies that are listed, generally speaking, have negligible holdings. And I do know that Infrastructure Ontario in 2017 was the object of a scathing report by the Auditor General on poor practice. So if you're in fact moving real estate holdings, and maybe relatively small ones, to an agency that has been found, and let's be generous, wanting by the Auditor General, I have to ask, why on earth are you doing it? Why are you not taking steps in this bill to set standards for management of real estate so that we aren't paying millions of dollars for vacant properties, so that we aren't overhousing our workforce, so that we aren't mixing our capital and our operating funds? If you were doing that, I think that would be a far more interesting debate. I don't think 14 or 20 or 5 is the critical thing. I think the critical thing is, do you have good management practice? I have no assurance that that, in fact, is what will come out of this bill.
Questions? The member for University Rosedale.
Thank you, Speaker, and thank you to the member for Toronto-Danforth for taking the time to look into the Auditor General's report and share with the House what the Auditor General found when they did a deep dive into Infrastructure Ontario. I've just got a general question. When this government is looking at changing the environmental assessment process again, I would call it weakening the environmental assessment process. What are the consequences of weakening the environmental assessment process? What happens when you start doing things like that?
The member for Toronto-Danforth.
Member for University of Rosedale, thank you for that question. Interestingly, my colleague from Spadina-Fort York touched on that earlier in his commentary. When you do not actually take steps to ensure that environmental protections are in place, you can not only set up a situation where you damage the natural world, but you can also put people's lives and property at risk. If you do not, in fact, have in place flood protection, then the potential is there that people's homes will be flooded, that they will incur tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars in damages to their homes. And you may well be aware, Speaker, within the past few years in New York City, a very severe storm caused about a dozen people to drown in their basement apartments. So if you do not actually pay attention to environmental standards, environmental issues, you put at risk life and property, and health, may I add. So undermining those protections that over decades we've built up make no sense at all. I'll just note, again, if I have time, the recent example in East Palestine, Ohio, where the railroad disaster, in many cases, is being attributed to deregulations by the Trump administration. Environmental assessment, health and safety regulation, all part of the same package. If you neglect them, you put people's lives, property, and health at risk.
Okay, next question, the member for Niagara West.
My thanks to the member for Davenport for participating this afternoon. I have to say it was very interesting to hear the member opposite speak with such concern about a piece of legislation that is going to ensure that we have a more efficient government. But I think that the takeaway I had from it, and it's a bit of a surprising one given the feedback that I've heard from the member opposite over the last few years, is that he seems to think that the PC government under the leadership of Premier Doug Ford is already so efficient that this bill is unnecessary. He seems to think that we don't need to have a bill that's reducing inefficiencies here in the government of Ontario. Now I can't speak for all my colleagues, but I can testify that the attitude that the Premier brings forward is that better is always possible. So my question to the member opposite is, if he believes that we are such an efficient government already, does he also not believe that better is always possible and that we need to make sure we're passing legislation such as this to address any efficiencies that might still exist?
Member for Toronto-Danforth.
Well, I'm very appreciative that the member asked that question because sometimes assuming the basis for my logic leads to an error. I don't think this is an efficient government at all. I think this is an outrageously inefficient government. I was talking to a small landlord last night. He's got an apartment, a condo on Carlisle Avenue in my riding where he can't get a hearing at the Landlord-Tenant Board. Why is that? Because you guys didn't appoint people at the level necessary to have proper functioning of that board. That's not efficiency. That is neglect. That means that tenants are getting beat up. That means that small landlords are getting beat up. That's not efficiency. You know what that is. That's chaos. When you bring forward a bill that says you're going to sort out the real estate issues, do you actually have standards within the bill saying you can't have a huge portfolio of vacant buildings that we're paying for? We're going to have a standard for space per employee that doesn't mean we're overhoused and thus wasting money, which is what you're doing. You're not setting a standard. You're turning it all over to an agency that the Auditor General raked over the coals. So if you want efficiency, set standards, smart standards, and enforce them. And when you actually start doing that, I might think that you're trying to deal with efficiency. Right now, all you're interested in is deregulation and making some people incredibly wealthy and making other people eat that in terms of risk to their lives and property, in terms of their health.
Member for Spadina, Fort York.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I thank the member from Toronto-Danforth for his comments today. This government's got quite the record on real estate holdings, and these are the holdings that actually belong to the people of this province. And we've seen them try to pave over the Duffins wetlands for a deal that they'd made apparently with the developer who was going to be leasing it out to Walmart or Costco. And then there was another deal, the Foundry. They'd made a deal with the developer to demolish these heritage buildings in the Foundry. In Ontario Place, they've made a deal with two international private for-profit companies that have nothing to do with Ontario, and they've committed Ontarians to spending some an estimated $650 million to prepare the site, only to hand it over in a long-term lease to this private for-profit company. The second part of this bill actually consolidates the real estate holdings of the people of this province in one agency. Do you have confidence that, based on their former lack of stewardship of public property, that this will lead to better performance, that this will lead to actual proper stewardship of the land that belongs to and the property that belongs to the people of this province?
Member for Toronto-Danforth.
Thank you, Speaker. I have to say to the member, I wish I'd written that question to give to you so that I could claim credit for it, because I enjoyed it so much. So first, I'll be direct right off the top. No, I don't have confidence that they'll actually manage this properly or look after the public interest. The Duffins Rouge Agricultural Preserve came into existence because the people of Ontario put big bucks into it. They preserved that land. It's part of flood control. It's part of agricultural production. And we're seeing it being dismantled by this government, who is effectively transferring wealth in the hundreds of millions of dollars into the hands of speculators. I would say that anyone who does that, any government that does that, has abandoned even the most simple principles of government, which is to sell things off at a profit, rather than give them away to friends who will sell them off at a profit. I find it extraordinary that they would do it. I don't find it extraordinary that they would attack the environment cut. That is standard.
Thank you.